Call me Dickie Smalls.
Papa Roach were initially lumped in with the rest of the nu metal pack during the initial late 90s, early 2000s explosion of the genre. They had a huge MTV hit with Last Resort, but they were largely written off by critics. Despite the song actually having some pretty heavy lyrical themes, they were definitely deeper than the usual nu metal fare. But despite being written off by critics, with everyone assuming that they'd be here today, gone tomorrow like so many of the other nu metal bands, they've stood the test of time and cemented themselves as legends. They're currently sitting at 12.5 million monthly listeners on Spotify. One of their songs has over 1 billion streams. They're at the top of the bill on seemingly half of all the major festivals. And these days, I think they're almost universally respected, with Last Resort being seen as one of the most iconic songs of its time. And so the question is, how did they do it? How did a few guys from a small town in California create one of the most enduring bands of their generation? And more importantly, what is their lasting legacy? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. And also, this video is sponsored by Helix Sleep. I've had my Helix mattress now for about a year, and honestly, I absolutely love it. It is so much more comfortable. They have over 20 unique mattresses, including options for kids and big and tall sleepers. Everybody's different, and Helix knows that. So they made a sleep quiz to match your unique body type and sleep preferences to the perfect mattress for you. And if you sleep with a partner, you can even take the sleep quiz together and find something that's the perfect compromise for both of you. Based on our results, Helix matched us with their Dusk Luxe mattress. My wife and I are both side sleepers who like kind of a medium mattress, so this is perfect for us, and we both sleep much better. And with your Helix sleep mattress, you get a 100-night sleep trial, along with a 10-year warranty, and there are financing options with flexible payment plans. Helix delivers your mattress right to your door for free within the US. It comes rolled up in a box, and it is super easy to set up yourself. And unlike other brands, Helix mattresses do not contain fiberglass, which, as you may know, can be hazardous to your health. I love my Helix mattress, and I think you would too. So if you're looking for a new bed, check out Helix Sleep. You can click the link below or go to helixsleep.com/punkrock to get 20% off your Helix mattress plus 2 free pillows. Papa Roach started out way back in January of 1993 when Jacoby Shaddix and Dave Buckner met on the Vacaville High School football field. Their original name was actually Papa Gatto, before Jacoby changed it to Papa Roach, which combined his grandfather's nicknames, one of which being Herbert Fisher, aka Papa, and John Grandpa Roach. And in 1994, they released their first EP called Potatoes for Christmas. And while you can kind of hear traces of what they would sound like in the future, this definitely doesn't sound like the Papa Roach that we know today. Although if you're a fan of the band, it's probably worth checking out, even though it is a bit rough around the edges. After that, on February 4th of 1997, the band released their first album called Old Friends from Young Years. It's definitely the heaviest thing that they've ever done, and at this point they're starting to sound a bit like the band that they would become on their first album, but still they're not quite there. It's also their most raw album. If I had to describe the production on this, I would say it sounds a little bit like the first Deftones album, and it's something that's slept on by even the band themselves because it's not on Spotify, but if you're a fan of the band, I think it's worth checking out. And after that, in October of 1999, they signed to DreamWorks Records, and as many of you know, this is where the band that we know today really began. And shortly after getting signed, they started working on their second album, which was also their major label debut. And in April of 2000, they released Infest. And if you were around back then, you know that this song was absolutely huge. The album essentially made them go from a local band to a worldwide phenomenon basically overnight, and honestly for good reason. The album as a whole is great, with a lot of catchy moments that I think really transcended nu metal, and songs that are now considered all-time classics, especially the song Last Resort, which probably even your older sister who doesn't even listen to music knows the lyrics to. I remember hearing it at the time, and even for me, as somebody who really thought nu metal was kind of corny and I really wasn't into it at the time, I just couldn't ignore the fact that that song was just insanely catchy. And because of that lead guitar riff, which almost sounded like a heavier Iron Maiden or something, it felt more like, I guess we could say, real metal than most things in the genre did. And the impact of that song alone, which was really a breakthrough mainstream hit that totally transcended the genre, was so massive that it got millions of people into heavy music. But more importantly than that, it was also one of the first examples of a mainstream song that tackled topics like mental health and self-harm in very direct language, which these days is really nothing special, but back then was pretty uncommon, so I think they deserve a lot of credit for what they did lyrically. And if I had to describe the sound of the album, although they do get labeled as nu metal, I think it's more fair to call this like nu metal adjacent, in the sense that it's a bit more aggressive than your average radio rock band, but at the same time a lot more accessible than many of the nu metal bands. So it could appeal to just like random normies, or the pop punk kids that listen to Blink-182 or Sum 41, but also to the rebellious nu metal kids. It had that sort of broad appeal across multiple different kinds of people in the same way as Linkin Park did. And so I think that's a big part of why it got so much traction. Infest would go on to be certified as triple platinum, which is still their biggest album to date and one of the biggest milestones of the early 2000s. And after the success of Infest, they toured relentlessly. Another big moment for them was their song Blood Brothers, getting featured in Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, which was a massive opportunity at the time because that was probably the pinnacle of the series' significance in terms of overall position in pop culture, back when every song on that soundtrack really meant something. And so for them to get a song in that game, I think really did a lot for their career, especially in terms of them capitalizing on the momentum that they had from Last Resort. And after that, in June of 2002, they released their follow-up to Infest called Love, Hate, Tragedy. And musically, they pretty much picked up where they left off on Infest, although they did put a little bit more emphasis on singing over rapping compared to Infest. But I think overall, if you liked Infest, then you probably enjoyed this one as well. And although it didn't sell as much as Infest, it charted higher in the US and the UK, and went on to be certified gold in the US within 2 months of its release. And after that, they changed things up a bit with their next album called Getting Away with Murder, which came out in August of 2004. With this one, they moved away a bit from the nu metal elements of their sound and went in more of a rock direction, which was a bit of a risk, but it paid off. The album was certified platinum in 2005, and the song Scars ended up being one of their biggest singles to date. And on the heels of that, in September of 2006, they released their fourth album called The Paramore Sessions. And also I think culturally it was a perfect fit for them because their music just really lends itself well to that WWE type of audience. And musically, this was again in line with Getting Away with Murder, moving away even more from their nu metal roots, at times even maybe sounding a little bit like Seether or something. In the brightest hour of my darkest day. And after a 3-year break in 2009, they released their next album called Metamorphosis. And even though it debuted at number 8 on Billboard, the band's first entry into the top 10 since 2002, this one was not received as well. Critics, for the most part, were not happy with it. For example, Chris Fallon of Absolute Punk had this to say about it. Big anthems, Jonas Brothers album cover, lyrics that weave in and out of ambition/unified hope and back alley corners. Too many times the band takes 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And while fans weren't as negative about it as the critics were, there was still a clear consensus that this really just wasn't as good as their earlier stuff. And these days, most fans, I think, enjoy it for what it is, but you won't find too many people saying that this is Papa Roach's best album. And I can see why. It's definitely not the worst thing I've heard, but it does feel a little bit bland and uninspired. It's one of those things where there's nothing wrong with it, but there's really nothing particularly right with it either. And after that, there was a situation that happened to a lot of bands of that era, which was the fact that their former label, Geffen Records, released a greatest hits compilation of the band with without their consent, while at the same time allegedly not giving the band any royalties from it since they had moved on to a new label called 11-7 Music. Even though I'm sure this was contractually allowed and probably legal, it's one of those things that's just kind of a scummy thing to do, but at that time it was just a thing that labels did. And after that, they released a live album called Time for Annihilation in 2010, which also had a few new songs, and their next full-length album called The Connection, which would release in October of 2012.
Never coming down. We're just living for today.
And this one was kind of interesting in that it was kind of like a combination of everything they've ever done, but still felt like a cohesive thing that really was just Papa Roach. It was definitely a massive step up from their last few releases, and honestly, I think it's a little underrated. So if you're a fan of the band and you haven't heard it, I would definitely suggest that you check it out.
I'm sick to my soul. I can't be controlled.
And 3 years later, in January of 2015, they released their next album, Fear.
The streets cry with a deadly omen. Outside I see a world that's broken.
And if their previous album was the band kind of finding their footing again, this one was them back in full swing. It was easily their best album in years, and personally, I thought it was cool that it felt very modern and contemporary, almost taking a little bit of influence from what was happening in kind of the gent modern metal world without trying too hard to be trendy. It was also the first time that they had features from other artists on the album, most notably Maria Brink from In This Moment on the song Gravity. And the band carried their newfound momentum into their next album, Crooked Teeth, which came out in 2017. And this one ended up being just as good, if not better, than Fear. And surprisingly, 2 of the singles ended up being some of the band's biggest songs to date, with both Help and Born for Greatness hitting #1 on the mainstream rock charts. So it was pretty cool that almost 20 years into their career, they were hitting a new high watermark with the first time that they had 2 songs from one album hitting #1, which to me sort of highlights one of the things that I've always liked most about Papa Roach, which is their ability to continuously reinvent themselves and stay relevant even as the trends change around them. And once again, there was the WWE connection when the song Born for Greatness became the main theme for WWE Raw in February of 2018.
Somebody sound the alarm.
But with all of that being said, even as the band felt like they had hit a new stride, things were about to get more divisive with their next album, Who Do You Trust, in 2019.
I wanna elevate.
And while this was by no means the worst album ever made, it was definitely the most divisive thing they've ever done since the album was essentially a pop record. A lot of fans even compared it to something they might have heard from Imagine Dragons. Definitely not what any rock band wants to hear. Another thing that I think you can hear a lot is drawing from maybe like Arctic Monkeys.
Who do you trust? Tell me, who do you trust?
And personally, even if it didn't really land very well with fans, I appreciate the band just taking a risk like that, because at this point they were well over 20 years into their career, so they could certainly just play things safe and do Infest over and over and over, but instead they're continually trying to find new ways to reinvent their sound, and that's something worth appreciating even if it doesn't land. Another thing they did that I thought was really cool around this time was their collab with Jarvis Johnson. He had just gone viral on TikTok for his cover/remix of Last Resort, and not only did they give it their blessing, they actually collaborated with him to do a whole new version of the song.
Don't give a fuck running through my head. All these years wishing I was dead.
And personally, I thought that was really cool of them. First of all, that they even recognized the talent of an up-and-coming new artist, where a lot of bands of their age don't pay attention to anything that's happening sort of in the underground anymore. And beyond that, that they even trusted him to do an update of what's by far their most iconic song. And personally, I thought it turned out really cool. And although their previous album was pretty divisive, things were about to get much less divisive with, at the time of this recording, their most recent album, Ego Trip, which came out in 2002. And this one is honestly comparable to the best stuff that they've ever done, going back to Getting Away with Murder or Infest, which is almost unheard of for a band that at this point is 30 years deep into their career. For one, they really just nailed the rock stuff that they're sort of known for, while also pulling off the genre-bending stuff that they had attempted on their previous album, only this time, in my opinion, doing it a lot better. Which brings us to the last question of this video. What is their lasting impact? For one, just because of their sheer reach, first with Last Resort, then being part of big cultural things like Tony Hawk Pro Skater and WWE, they were a gateway band that got millions and millions of people into heavy music. And I think you can see that because so many of the bigger current bands are very obviously influenced by them. With probably the most notable example of that being Falling in Reverse, who I would say are probably the biggest band of their sort of generation, doing their own version of Last Resort, again with the blessing of Jacoby and Papa Roach.
This is my last resort. Suffocation, no breathing.
And so I think the fact that they keep their ear to the street and collaborate with people like Jarvis Johnson and Ronnie Radke, these younger up-and-coming artists, although I guess Ronnie isn't up-and-coming, but you know what I mean. I think that is a big part of why they're more relevant today than a lot of their peers who sort of lost track with what's happening. And the last thing I'd like to mention is how they really push things forward with the topic of mental health in the music industry, with a song like Last Resort being one of the very first mainstream songs to really tackle it head on like that. Obviously, there have been lots of songs that sort of hinted at that, and if you read between the lines, you sort of knew what they were talking about. But with Last Resort, they just hit you over the head with it in a way that I think was really refreshing and transparent, sort of removing a lot of the stigma that we had about just saying, hey, I'm going through this. But what I really like about it is they weren't just wallowing in those feelings, they were giving you a path to hopefully overcome them. For example, the singer Jacoby Shaddix has had his own issues with things like alcohol and drug abuse, and he's pretty outspoken about it. But overall, he's really just an extremely positive guy that always really highlights the fact that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. That no matter how hard things are right now, don't give up because there is hope. And personally, I think that's something we need a lot more of in the music industry, especially because so many of the other artists now that talk about this stuff really don't have that positive component to their message. If anything, I think a lot of these artists maybe encourage people to sort of stay stuck in those feelings.
Start picking up your phone and answering it when people call you. Start calling people that you love and telling them that you love them against your inclination of just wanting to isolate. Go for a run every day. Do that every day and see where you're at in 10 days.
And so the fact that Papa Roach has this consistently positive message of hope, I think is really important. And with all of that being said, I have no idea when they're going to decide to hang it up, but they've been at it for over 30 years now. And whenever they do, I think they will be remembered as one of the most influential bands of their generation. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my podcasts and videos early. I do Q&As, I do giveaways sometimes, and there's also a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.